The bell rang sharply across Westwood High School, signaling the start of fifth-period American history. The hallway chaos settled as students filed into Mr. Peterson's classroom, finding their usual spots with the practiced routine of mid-semester familiarity. Darius kept his eyes down as he slipped into his seat in the back row. His worn blue backpack, covered with pins from his mom's civil rights organization, rested against his chair leg. At 17, being one of only 4 black students in this suburban Atlanta school meant he'd become skilled at being present without drawing attention. The classroom had its usual smell of dry erase markers and the faint scent of the pizza served at lunch. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead while outside, spring sunshine tried its best to break through blinds that were permanently half-closed. "Pass these back," Mr. Peterson ordered, handing stacks of worksheets to students in the front row. His voice carried the same bored tone it always did, but today there was something else, a hint of something that made Darius look up from his notebook. Mr. Peterson had been teaching at Westwood for 15 years. He wore the same style of khaki pants every day and had a collection of university logo polo shirts he rotated through the week. Students generally found him forgettable, neither particularly kind nor especially mean, just another adult they had to please to get their credits. But Darius had noticed things others might miss. The way Mr. Peterson would rush through mentions of Frederick Douglass but spend 3 days on Abraham Lincoln. How he'd dismiss questions about Harriet Tubman but entertain lengthy discussions about Confederate generals. Small things perhaps, but they built up over time like drops of water wearing away stone. Today, Mr. Peterson announced, straightening papers on his desk, "We begin our unit on the civil rights movement." He clicked his presentation remote and the projector flickered to life, displaying a timeline spanning from 1954 to 1968. The air in the classroom seemed to change. A few students shifted in their seats. Darius felt his heart rate quicken slightly. He'd been dreading this unit since the semester began. "We'll be discussing various figures from this era," Mr. Peterson continued, clicking to the next slide showing photographs of Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X side by side. A small, almost imperceptible smirk crossed his face, or as I like to call them, the so-called heroes of the movement. The emphasis he placed on so-called wasn't lost on anyone. Across the room, Darius noticed Lee, a quiet white girl who always had her nose in a book about social justice, look up sharply. Their eyes met briefly in shared recognition of what was happening. From the middle of the classroom, Taylor, another student, coughed uncomfortably. Even those who normally dozed through history seemed suddenly alert, sensing the tension building in the room. Darius gripped his pencil tighter. His grandmother's stories echoed in his mind, how she'd marched in Selma, how she'd faced water hoses and police dogs. On his wrist, he wore a bracelet she'd given him, woven with threads from her original protest sign. "Remember whose shoulders you stand on," she always told him. Mr. Peterson clicked to the next slide. "Let's begin by examining why these men were more problematic than your textbooks suggest." The casual way he said it, as if commenting on the weather rather than dismissing pivotal historical figures, made it all the more jarring. Several students exchanged glances. This wasn't just the usual glossing over of Black history. This was something different, something deliberate. The classroom felt smaller suddenly, the air heavier. Darius opened his notebook slowly, his grandmother's voice still in his mind. Next to his perfectly organized notes, he began to write down every word Mr. Peterson said. Something told him these would matter later. As Mr. Peterson launched into his lecture, Darius noticed his hand was shaking slightly, but he kept writing. Sometimes, documentation was its own form of resistance. The projector hummed as Mr. Peterson advanced to his next slide. The classroom lights dimmed slightly, casting the images of Dr. King and Malcolm X in stark relief against the white wall. The two leaders' photographs stared back at 27 pairs of teenage eyes, their historical significance about to be twisted by a man who clearly had no reverence for either. "Let's talk about Martin Luther King Jr.," Mr. Peterson began, tapping his wooden pointer against the image. "Your textbooks paint him as a saint, but what they conveniently leave out is his academic history." He paused dramatically. "Did you know parts of his doctoral dissertation were plagiarized?" Yes, the great dreamer wasn't above cutting corners. A soft gasp came from somewhere in the middle of the classroom. Darius felt his jaw tighten as he continued taking notes, documenting every word. And Malcolm X, Mr. Peterson continued, his voice taking on an edge that hadn't been there moments before. Nothing but an ex-con who traded crime for radical rhetoric. His solution: violence and separation. Some hero. The casual dismissal of these complex historical figures hung in the air like smoke. It wasn't just what Mr. Peterson was saying, it was how he said it, with a smug certainty that dared anyone to challenge him. Lee raised her hand, her face flushed with visible frustration. Mr. Peterson's eyes swept past her as if she were invisible. She kept her hand up, unwavering. The civil rights movement, he continued, clicking to a slide showing protesters being blasted with fire hoses, was hardly the peaceful demonstration they claim in your textbooks. These people disrupted businesses, blocked traffic, and broke laws. He said it as if discussing litterbugs rather than people fighting for basic human dignity. Darius felt heat rising from his collar. The bracelet on his wrist, the one his grandmother had given him, suddenly felt heavier. His heart hammered against his ribs as Mr. Peterson clicked through more slides, each one accompanied by another dismissive comment. King's famous speech. A nice collection of pretty words that ignored the realities of American society. Click. Malcolm X's influence? Limited to those who wanted excuses for their anger rather than solutions. Click. The entire movement, largely exaggerated in its importance and effectiveness. Around the room, discomfort was evident. Taylor had stopped taking notes altogether and was staring at Mr. Peterson with undisguised shock. Another student, Chen, who rarely spoke in class, was frantically texting under his desk, probably messaging friends in other classes about what was happening. Lee's hand remained raised, her determination unwavering despite being ignored for nearly 10 minutes. "Sir," she finally said, without waiting to be called on, "I have a question about your sources." Mr. Peterson's head snapped in her direction. "You'll raise your hand and wait to be recognized, Miss Wilson." "I've had my hand up since you started talking about Dr. King," she replied, her voice steady despite her trembling fingers. "And I'll get to you when I'm ready," he responded coldly before turning back to the presentation. Darius watched this exchange with growing tension in his chest. The classroom felt like a powder keg, with Mr. Peterson casually flicking matches. He glanced at his phone, wondering if he should record this, but knew that would only make him a target. Instead, he flipped to a fresh page in his notebook and began writing down quotes, not Mr. Peterson's distortions, but the actual words of Dr. King and Malcolm X that his grandmother had taught him, the words that had inspired generations, the words that this teacher was trying to erase with his biased commentary. As Mr. Peterson moved on to belittle the impact of the Montgomery bus boycott, Darius felt something shifting inside him. The quiet student who had spent years trying not to be noticed was disappearing, replaced by someone who wouldn't remain silent much longer. His grandmother hadn't faced dogs and fire hoses, so that decades later, their grandson could sit quietly while history was rewritten. The minute hand on the clock moved painfully slow as the lecture continued. Mr. Peterson was now showing footage of the March on Washington, speaking over Dr. King's voice with commentary about overblown rhetoric and unrealistic demands. Darius closed his notebook slowly, his decision made. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about respect for those who had sacrificed everything. It was about truth. And sometimes truth demanded action. The classroom clock ticked loudly in the corner, marking each passing moment of Mr. Peterson's increasingly offensive lecture. Outside, clouds had begun to gather, darkening the windows and casting shadows across the room that matched the growing heaviness in Darius's chest. "These protesters," Mr. Peterson said, pointing to a black and white photograph of young people being dragged away by police, "were not heroes but lawbreakers who disrupted good, hard-working Americans just trying to go about their business." His tone was matter-of-fact, as if stating an obvious truth rather than a twisted perspective. Several students had given up taking notes entirely. Lee still sat with her hand partially raised, though the determination in her posture had been replaced by a sort of defeated anger. Taylor kept looking between Darius and the door, as if wondering whether anyone was going to do something or if they were all just going to sit there and take it. Mr. Peterson clicked to a new slide showing Malcolm X speaking at a podium, finger pointed passionately toward his audience. Malcolm X's philosophy can be summed up quite simply, the teacher said with a dismissive wave. It was just anti-white hatred dressed up as empowerment, nothing more. That was it. That was the moment. The pencil in Darius's hand snapped in two, the sound barely audible but the feeling enormous. Something inside him broke along with it, the carefully constructed wall between his true thoughts and what he allowed himself to say in this school where he was always outnumbered. Mr. Peterson's words weren't just wrong. They were a direct attack on everything Darius's family stood for. His grandmother hadn't just told him stories about the movement, she'd lived it. The scar on her shoulder where a police dog had bitten her in Birmingham wasn't a tale. It was a permanent reminder of what real courage looked like. And his grandfather, quiet, dignified Grandpa Joe, had walked alongside Dr. King in the March on Washington. Not because I was brave, he told Darius, but because staying home would have been an unforgivable act of cowardice. The one copy of Malcolm X's autobiography on Darius's nightstand wasn't just a book, it was a family heirloom, passed down with reverence. Even his name, Darius, had been chosen to honor his great-uncle who had been one of the first black students to integrate the local university, facing daily threats with nothing but determination and schoolbooks in his arms. Mr. Peterson was now saying something about how the movement had exaggerated the difficulties faced by black Americans, his voice droning on with the confidence of someone who has never had their version of history challenged. A memory flashed in Darius's mind, his grandmother sitting on her porch, holding his face between her weathered hands. History isn't just what happened, she told him. It's also who gets to tell the story. Never let anyone tell your story wrong. The classroom felt suddenly too small, too hot. Darius's heartbeat thundered in his ears as he looked around at his classmates, some uncomfortable, some indifferent, some possibly even agreeing with Mr. Peterson. Did none of them understand what was happening here? This wasn't just bad teaching, it was erasure. It was disrespect, it was wrong. Mr. Peterson had moved on to a slide showing protesters being hit with fire hoses, their bodies contorted by the force of the water. Sometimes police had to use necessary force to maintain order, he commented casually. The bracelet on Darius's wrist, the one containing threads from his grandmother's original protest sign, seemed to burn against his skin. In his backpack was his grandfather's worn copy of Why We Can't Wait by Dr. King, and beside it, the autobiography of Malcolm X that 3 generations of his family had read, pages dog-eared and margins filled with notes. Darius had spent 3 years at this school being quiet, keeping his head down, not making waves. 3 years of biting his tongue when history was misrepresented. 3 years of being the good black student who didn't cause trouble. But as Mr. Peterson labeled Malcolm X a thug who got lucky with a microphone, something shifted permanently inside Darius. The tension in his shoulders, the heat in his face, the pounding in his chest, all of it crystallized into a single clear thought: not today. Without fully realizing he was doing it, Darius found himself pushing back his chair. The scraping sound cut through Mr. Peterson's voice, causing heads to turn. Darius stood, legs slightly shaky but resolve firm. His voice, when he finally spoke, surprised even himself with its clarity and strength. "That's not true," he said simply. "And I can't sit here and listen to this anymore." The classroom fell silent. 27 faces turned toward Darius, expressions ranging from shock to quiet approval. The only sound was the soft hum of the projector and the distant noise of a gym class outside. Time seemed to freeze as student and teacher locked eyes across the room. Mr. Peterson's face flushed red, starting at his neck and creeping upward. "Excuse me." His voice was dangerously quiet. "I said that's not true," Darius repeated, his heart hammering so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. "What you're saying about Dr. King and Malcolm X, it's not historically accurate." Mr. Peterson's eyes narrowed. "Sit down, Mr. Jackson. This is not a debate club." "With all due respect, sir, this isn't a debate. These are facts." Darius's voice grew steadier with each word. "You called Dr. King a plagiarist, but you didn't mention his letter from Birmingham jail or his work on economic justice. You reduced Malcolm X to hatred and violence without discussing his evolution after his pilgrimage to Mecca." The classroom remained eerily silent. No one moved, as if afraid that any motion might break the spell of this unexpected moment. "I will not be lectured in my own classroom," Mr. Peterson said, voice rising. "Sit down now, or you can explain your disruption to Principal Winters." Darius didn't sit. Instead, he bent down and unzipped his backpack, pulse pounding in his ears. His fingers found the two books, his grandfather's one copy of Why We Can't Wait by Dr. King and the autobiography of Malcolm X. He pulled them out, holding them like precious artifacts. "My grandfather gave me these," he said, surprised by the steadiness in his voice. "He was at the March on Washington. My grandmother still has scars from police dogs in Birmingham." He held up the books. "May I share what these men actually said, since that seems to be missing from your presentation?" A few students gasped. No one challenged teachers at Westwood, especially not Mr. Peterson, known for his vindictive grading and long memory for perceived slights. "That's enough." Mr. Peterson slammed his hand on the desk. "This is my classroom." "I'd like to hear what he has to say," came a voice from the front. It was Lee, finally dropping her raised hand and speaking without permission. Her face was flushed but determined. Mr. Peterson turned toward her, his mouth opening to respond when another voice chimed in. "Me too," said Taylor from the middle row. "This is supposed to be a history class. Let's hear some actual history." Mr. Peterson's hand moved toward the classroom phone, the direct line to the main office, but before he could reach it, Chen spoke up from his corner seat. "Sir, isn't the point of education to hear different perspectives? Isn't that what you told us on the first day of class?" The teacher's hand froze mid-reach. His eyes swept the room, perhaps realizing for the first time that the dynamics had shifted. This wasn't just one student being disruptive, something larger was happening. Darius took a deep breath and opened the first book, turning to a dog-eared page his grandfather had marked decades ago. "From Dr. King's letter from Birmingham jail," he began, his voice growing more confident with each word. "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly." He looked up, making eye contact with various classmates. Some nodded slightly, others looked thoughtful. Mr. Peterson stood frozen, seemingly unsure how to regain control of a classroom that had slipped from his grasp. Darius turned to the other book. "And from Malcolm X, after his pilgrimage to Mecca. I've had enough of someone else's propaganda. I'm for truth, no matter who tells it. I'm for justice, no matter who it's for or against." The words hung in the air, powerful and undeniable. Someone in the back of the room began to clap slowly. Then another joined, and another. Mr. Peterson's face was a storm of emotions, anger, embarrassment, and perhaps a flicker of uncertainty. "This is completely inappropriate," he began, but his words were drowned out as more students joined the applause. Darius hadn't planned this moment. He'd spent years trying to blend in to avoid making waves. But standing there, his grandfather's books in his hands, his grandmother's bracelet on his wrist, he felt a strange new sensation washing over him. It wasn't anger anymore. It was something else, something that felt oddly like freedom. The applause faded as Mr. Peterson slammed his textbook closed with a sharp crack that echoed through the classroom. His face had turned from red to an alarming shade of purple. "That's enough," he shouted, his composure completely gone. "This is not a student forum. This is a history class, and I am the teacher." But something had changed in the room. The bubble of fear that usually surrounded Mr. Peterson had popped. Students who normally wouldn't dare to make eye contact with him were now watching openly, some with small smiles playing at the corners of their mouths. Darius remained standing, the book still in his hands. "You're right, sir. This is a history class. That's why we should be learning actual history, not distortions." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Mr. Peterson reached for the classroom phone again, his hand visibly shaking. "I'm calling security to remove you," he threatened, picking up the receiver. Lee stood up then, closing her notebook with deliberate slowness. "If Darius goes, I go too." Her voice trembled slightly, but her chin was raised in defiance. Taylor pushed back his chair next. "Same here." One by one, students began to stand, not all of them, but enough. 8, then 12, then 15. More than half the class was on their feet, united by something stronger than fear of one angry teacher. Mr. Peterson's hand froze on the phone. He looked around the room, seeming to realize that he couldn't send half his class to the principal's office without serious questions being asked. "Fine," he said at last, replacing the receiver with a shaking hand. "You want to hear more from your classmate? Let's see if he actually knows what he's talking about." His tone was mocking, a last attempt to regain control. "Go ahead, Mr. Jackson, enlighten us all." It was a trap, and everyone knew it. Mr. Peterson was waiting for Darius to stumble, to say something incorrect that could be used to dismiss everything else he'd said. The tension in the room was thick enough to touch. Darius took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. The easy thing would be to sit down, to apologize, to retreat. But his grandmother's voice echoed in his mind. Truth doesn't fear questions. "I don't claim to know everything," Darius began carefully. "But I do know that both Dr. King and Malcolm X were complex men whose views evolved over time. I know that reducing them to caricatures does a disservice not just to them, but to all of us trying to understand history." He opened the autobiography of Malcolm X again, turning to a specific passage. After his pilgrimage to Mecca, Malcolm X wrote about how his views on race had transformed. He said he had met blonde-haired, blue-eyed men I could call my brothers. That doesn't sound like someone filled with hatred. Mr. Peterson scoffed. One quote doesn't erase years off. And Dr. King, Darius continued, not allowing the interruption to throw him off, wasn't just talking about dreams. In his later years, he focused heavily on economic justice and spoke out against the Vietnam War at great personal cost. He said, "A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death." A few students were nodding now, some taking notes, actual notes, not the mindless copying they usually did during Mr. Peterson's lectures. These men weren't perfect, Darius acknowledged. No one is. But they deserve to be understood in their fullness, not reduced to whatever fits a comfortable narrative. The class was silent now, absorbing his words. Even those who hadn't stood up were listening with new attention. Mr. Peterson's eyes narrowed, searching for a weakness, a way to regain the upper hand. "And I suppose you think your little book report changes the curriculum? You think you know better than someone with a master's degree in history?" Before Darius could answer, Chen spoke up from across the room, his voice quiet but clear. "Sir, my phone has been recording this entire class." He held up his smartphone, the screen showing an active recording. "My dad's on the school board. Should I send this to him, or would you prefer to have an actual discussion about civil rights leaders?" The color drained from Mr. Peterson's face. Recording a teacher without permission was against school rules, but what the recording contained would raise far more serious questions. In that moment, the power in the room shifted completely. It wasn't just about Darius anymore. It wasn't even about Mr. Peterson. It was about something much larger, the right of students to hear the truth, the responsibility of teachers to present history honestly, and the courage it takes to stand up when something is wrong. Mr. Peterson looked from Chen's phone to the standing students to Darius, still holding his grandfather's books. For the first time since Darius had known him, the teacher seemed at a complete loss for words. By lunchtime, the story had spread through Westwood High like wildfire. Students who hadn't even been in the classroom were discussing what had happened with a mixture of awe and excitement. The cafeteria buzzed with whispered conversations and occasional glances toward Darius, who sat at his usual corner table, trying to eat his lunch despite the knot in his stomach. "Is it true you made Peterson cry?" asked a sophomore, Darius barely nude, sliding onto the bench across from him. "What?" "No," Darius said, shaking his head. "I just corrected some things he said about Dr. King and Malcolm X." But rumors had already taken on a life of their own. Some said Darius had recited entire speeches from memory. Others claimed Mr. Peterson had been escorted from the building. The truth was somewhere in between. After Chen's revelation about the recording, Mr. Peterson had called a self-study period and sat silently at his desk for the remainder of class, avoiding eye contact with everyone. Lee appeared at the table, lunch tray in hand. "Mind if I join you?" Without waiting for an answer, she sat down. "That was the bravest thing I've ever seen anyone do in this school," she said quietly. Darius shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention. "I just couldn't listen to it anymore." "That's what makes it brave," she replied. The rest of us were just sitting there, feeling bad but doing nothing. Taylor and Chen joined them moments later, followed by a few other students from the class. Suddenly, Darius's usually empty table was crowded. "My dad called the principal," Chen said, keeping his voice low. "He's coming in for a meeting after school." "They want to talk to you too." Darius's stomach dropped. "Am I in trouble?" "Dude, you're the opposite of trouble," Taylor said. "You're like a hero or something." A hero? The word felt strange, too big for what he'd done. He hadn't planned to make a stand, he'd just reached his breaking point. But looking around at the faces of his classmates, people who had barely spoken to him in 3 years, he realized something had fundamentally changed. After lunch, Darius headed to his locker to grab books for his next class. As he closed the metal door, he found himself face to face with Ms. Rodriguez, the young Spanish teacher whose classroom was across from Mr. Peterson's. "I heard what happened," she said without preamble. "A few students from your class told me." Darius braced himself for a lecture about respecting teachers or following proper channels. Instead, she smiled. "Thank you," she said simply. "Some of us have been concerned about Mr. Peterson's teaching for years, but without student complaints, there wasn't much we could do." She glanced around to make sure no one was listening. Not all teachers agree with his approach. Throughout the afternoon, Darius noticed other small changes. Students he passed in hallways for years without a word suddenly nodded or smiled in recognition. A teacher who had never shown particular interest in him asked thoughtful questions about his family's connection to the civil rights movement. After his last class, the school secretary handed him a note requesting his presence in Principal Winter's office. As he walked the long hallway, Darius tried to calm his racing heart. What if this turned against him? What if Mr. Peterson twisted the story? What if his parents were angry about him causing trouble? Outside the principal's office, his phone buzzed with a text from his grandmother. "Got a call from school. Don't worry. Remember what I always say, truth stands even when people fall." How did she always know exactly what to say? With renewed courage, Darius knocked on the heavy wooden door. Inside, he found not just Principal Winters, but also Mr. Peterson, Chen and his father, and to his surprise, his own parents. His mother's expression was unreadable, but his father gave him a subtle nod that settled some of his anxiety. "Darius," Principal Winters began, her tone formal but not unkind. "We're here to discuss the events in Mr. Peterson's class today. Chen has provided us with a recording, which I've reviewed, but I'd like to hear your perspective as well." Mr. Peterson sat stiffly in his chair, eyes fixed on the window behind the principal's desk, refusing to look at anyone else in the room. Taking a deep breath, Darius explained exactly what had happened, the dismissive comments, the historical inaccuracies, his decision to speak up. He didn't embellish or accuse. He simply told the truth, ending with, "I respect the position of teachers, but I also believe we all have a responsibility to history." When he finished, the room was quiet. Then Chen's father spoke. "As a member of the school board, I find this deeply concerning," he said. "Not a student respectfully challenging misinformation, but the misinformation itself being presented as fact in our classrooms." Darius's mother reached over and squeezed his hand, pride evident in her eyes. "I've spoken with several other students who confirmed Darius's account," Principal Winters said. "And this isn't the first concern we've had about Mr. Peterson's teaching methods." She turned to the teacher. "We'll be conducting a full review of your curriculum and teaching materials, effective immediately." For the first time, Mr. Peterson looked directly at Darius, his expression a mixture of anger and something else, perhaps the realization that he was no longer untouchable, that his classroom was not his private kingdom after all. 3 weeks later, Darius stood at the entrance to the school auditorium, watching as students and parents filed in for what the administration had called a community education evening. Posters along the hallway announced the topic, the Civil Rights Movement, Voices, Perspectives, and Legacy. The transformation that had taken place at Westwood High over the past 21 days still felt surreal. Mr. Peterson had been placed on administrative leave pending a thorough review of his teaching materials and methods. In his place, the school had brought in a substitute teacher who happened to have a doctorate in African American history. "Ready for this?" Lee appeared beside Darius, holding a stack of programs for the evening's event. Not really, he admitted. Public speaking had never been his thing, but somehow he'd been talked into introducing tonight's guest speaker. "You'll be great," she assured him, handing him a program. "Look at what you started." What he'd started had grown far beyond anything he could have imagined. After that day in class, several other students had come forward with their own stories about Mr. Peterson's problematic teaching, not just about the civil rights movement, but about Native American history, women's suffrage, and immigration. Parents had expressed outrage, the school board had launched an investigation, and local news outlets had picked up the story. But what surprised Darius most wasn't the trouble Mr. Peterson found himself in, it was the positive changes that had emerged from the confrontation. When Principal Winters asked for student volunteers to join a committee to review and improve the history curriculum, dozens had signed up. When a call went out for family stories connected to historical events, submissions flooded in. Nervous? His father's voice broke into his thoughts as his parents joined him at the entrance. "A little," Darius admitted. "Your grandfather would be so proud," his mother said, straightening his collar. He always said one voice could change a room. The thought of his grandfather gave him strength. After all, what was introducing a speaker compared to facing fire hoses and police dogs? What was a few minutes of stage fright compared to the courage it took to march for basic human dignity? Inside the auditorium, nearly every seat was filled. Teachers, students, parents, and community members had all turned out. At the back, a local news crew was setting up cameras. Darius spotted Chen and his father in the front row, alongside Principal Winters and several members of the school board. As Darius made his way to the side of the stage, he passed a display set up by the school's art department, a collage of photographs from the civil rights era alongside contemporary images of ongoing struggles for justice. Someone had added a photo taken in Mr. Peterson's classroom the day of the confrontation, showing students standing in solidarity. The caption read, "The arc of history continues. 5 minutes," the vice principal whispered, handing him a microphone. Darius nodded, breathing deeply. From his pocket, he took out his grandmother's bracelet, the one with threads from her original protest sign. He hadn't worn it since that day in class, but tonight seemed right. He slipped it onto his wrist, drawing comfort from its familiar weight. At exactly 7 o'clock, Principal Winters approached the podium. "Good evening," she began. "3 weeks ago, something important happened in one of our classrooms. A student reminded us that history isn't just a subject we teach, it's the story of real people's lives, struggles, and triumphs. Tonight is part of our commitment to telling that story more fully and truthfully." She gestured toward Darius. "I'd like to invite the young man who started this conversation to introduce our guest speaker." Walking to the podium felt like the longest journey of his life. Faces turned toward him, some familiar, many not. The lights seemed impossibly bright. But as he adjusted the microphone, Darius caught sight of his grandmother in the third row, her eyes shining with tears and pride. "Good evening," he began, his voice stronger than he expected. 3 weeks ago, I stood up in class because I couldn't listen to the misrepresentation of history any longer. I didn't do it to get a teacher in trouble. I did it because truth matters, especially when it comes to understanding where we've been and where we might go." As he spoke, Darius noticed something remarkable happening in the audience. People were nodding, not just listening politely but truly engaging with his words. Tonight's speaker marched in Selma as a young man. He was there on Bloody Sunday. He felt the batons and heard the screams. His history isn't something you can dismiss or twist. It's written in scars he still carries today. And we're honored that he's here to share that history with us, my grandfather, Joseph Jackson. The applause was thunderous as his grandfather rose from his seat, walking slowly but proudly to the stage. The two embraced before Darius stepped aside, making room for a man who had helped bend the arc of history toward justice long before Darius was born. As he took his seat in the front row, Darius realized something profound had shifted, not just in his school but in himself. The quiet boy who had spent years trying not to be noticed had found his voice, and in finding it, he had helped others find theirs too. Sometimes courage was loud and dramatic, like marching across a bridge in Selma. But sometimes it was as simple as standing up in a classroom and saying, "That's not true." Both mattered, both changed the world.